So we've had waves of Russian jets and drones flying into NATO airspace, Tom. This month alone, there have been illegal incursions into Poland, Estonia, Romania, Norway, and just lately this weekend, we think also Denmark. All of it presents NATO with its biggest test of alliance credibility since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine.
Critical infrastructure is being put at risk, flights brought to a standstill, and civilian lives endangered. So what on earth is Putin up to? What does NATO do about it? And just how close are we getting to a hot shooting war with Russia? Those are the burning questions exercising the alliance's finest minds. I'm Tom.
And I'm Patrick. Welcome back to The General and the Journalist.
So Patrick, picture the scene, probably going on roundabout right now actually. It's happening as we speak, as we talk. Europe's leaders arriving in Copenhagen, Keir Starmer amongst them, to discuss the drone threat and what more they can do to help Ukraine. But just simply to land in the Danish capital, to get their planes on the tarmac, NATO's launched the most extraordinary operation to ward away precisely those sort of Russian drones. So France, Sweden and Britain have all sent troops. France sent helicopters and high-tech equipment too. Germany has even put a frigate in the water, in the sea, close to the airport. Hundreds of millions of pounds worth of stuff just to ward off a few drones that probably cost a few £1,000s. And they're tiny in comparison, the size of a small coffee table. You might say an elephant trying to swat off a gnat. The very definition of grey zone asymmetric warfare, isn't it, Patrick?
Yeah, I don't like that term, asymmetric, because all warfare should be asymmetric. But it's definitely grey zone because it's neither peace, but nor is it war yet either. So yeah, I think it's hard to disagree. And I think this term warfare is the right word to use because there's a real parallel with something that was written in Moscow in 1946. Do you know George Kennan? You know who I mean by George Kennan?
Not personally. I'm aware of the name, though. A legend of diplomacy.
Yeah, so legend of diplomacy, great strategic mind, and he really was the architect of the West's, particularly the US's, Cold War strategy of containment towards the Soviet Union. And what he did was write this thing called a famous long telegram from Moscow when he was the chargé d'affaires in Moscow in 1946. And what he warned was that Moscow was going to wage what he called political warfare, and that's disinformation, it's subversion, it's probing weaknesses rather than direct attacks. And that fits Russia's, you said grey zone, hybrid tactics today, almost word for word. So to those lists, those words that I used, you can also add today cyber operations, hacking and ransomware, use of proxies, like the Wagner Group, instead of front organizations, which the Soviet Union had, and then election interference, sabotage, assassinations. And to that long list, you can now add drone incursions. But it's not just happening in Europe, Tom, is it?
No, it is not. Last Thursday, US fighters were scrambled to intercept 4 Russian jets flying very close to American airspace, just off the coast of Alaska, right up there in the Arctic. And that was the third time in a month that Russian jets had come very close to Alaska and that the US had been forced to scramble to intercept them. So all of these incidents positively identified as Russian jets or drones. No doubt about that, apart from maybe those in Denmark, the ones that are bothering everyone in Copenhagen today. But Pat, there's little doubt that that's also the work of Russia, is there?
I think so. I don't think there's any doubt at all. And there's no doubt that it was intentional. I mean, all of this that we've seen is just too coordinated. If you take the one in Poland, what you ended up with is drones originating from 4 different points, all converging onto Poland. You've got this lengthy, 15-minute incursion into Estonian airspace. So if it walks like a duck and it quacks like a duck, it's probably a duck, Tom. So let's talk about what Putin's up to. Russia, of course, has carried out sort of probing air incursions, long-range patrols for 20 years or more. But we're seeing a really significant increase in them, and this is a pattern. Starting on the 10th of September, right up until the 26th, 27th of September, you've seen the drones, 20 Russian drones also flying into Poland. You've seen a drone in Romanian airspace. The big Estonian episode where 3 Russian MiG jets entered Estonian airspace and then lingered there for 15 minutes or so. And then, of course, Alaska, as you mentioned. So this looks like a clear change in Kremlin policy. What's Putin up to, Tom?
Yeah, I mean, there's been a clear change in Kremlin policy. The tempo, you're right, this stuff has been going for a while, but the tempo and the aggressiveness is a significant sea change. So something has definitely changed. Obviously, it's purposeful. There's a number of reasons what he's up to. No one really knows because, of course, he hasn't stuck out a press release and been kind enough to tell us. But there's about 3 reasons. The most talked about is as a test. So testing NATO's military reaction times, but also political unity. So military means,
The military one, I mean, there is something in that because what they might learn either from our tactics or responses or our doctrine, or simply our electronic emissions, electronic signature. They could be looking just to find out, to probe for a weakness, a vulnerability.
Yeah, and look, and we do the same to them. We won't do things quite so hostile, but we'll try and work out, how quickly can they scramble stuff, etc. So military testing. What I think is really going on here, though, and the arguments are far stronger for this, is it's a political test. So, in other words, he is trying to work out whether NATO have the will for a fight or whether we're breakable politically. And that basically means, can he split the alliance? Will we all respond as one? Or can he split us off and start us arguing amongst each other? Because if we do start splitting off, NATO will effectively collapse. And it will collapse, crucially. One country triggers Article 5, actually gets attacked. An attack on one is an attack on all, says Article 5. And every other nation doesn't respond in unison, then NATO is basically severely broken. So that's the key test. And really, he's testing the United States. That's the key player in NATO, still is, always will be for as long as NATO survives. He's really testing what is Donald Trump doing and what would he do in that sort of Article 5 type scenario.
Yeah, and the Article 5 thing is just worth dwelling on for a second, because what Article 5 says is that member states should treat an attack on another alliance member as an attack on themselves. What it doesn't say is that you then automatically have to go to war or to fight. And that, I think you're spot on. I think this is first and foremost a political test. And, we know that Putin's macro goal is to cause the collapse of NATO and to rewrite the international security architecture in Europe.
And it could be that, who knows, maybe Vladimir Putin was listening to Donald Trump when he was on Air Force One, flying over to the NATO summit where I was and you were advising from Times Towers. And he saw Donald Trump's clip on Air Force One, which was, Mr. President, will you stand by Article 5? To which Donald Trump said, well, there are many different definitions of Article 5. It depends what you mean. And there was Donald Trump opening the door, really, to Vladimir Putin on this one.
Yeah.
But there are other reasons.
Yeah, so I think another one is coercion, and also punishment. So what do I mean by punishment? I think he's looking to punish Western support for the support that we're giving to Ukraine, and particularly that campaign of deep strikes against Russian oil and energy infrastructure, and against some political targets. Crimea, I think, is now running out of fuel, and that's how effective the Ukrainians have been. It could be that he's looking to punish individual states. I mean, the Danish ones, so the Danes, quite close to Copenhagen, host Ukrainian missile fuel production, so it might be about punishing that. But it's primarily, I think, about coercion. He's desperate to deter, to scare us away from deeper involvement in the war, but also looking ahead to the discussions we're having around security guarantees and deployment of assurance forces into Ukraine. And then there might just be some retaliation. I mean, don't forget that Russian airports are closing all the time because of Ukrainian drone incursions, and he might be trying to play that back at us.
There's a third reason, which we should just dwell on, and some people have suggested this. He is actually trying to map out an invasion. So he's trying to work out, with those tests of our quick reaction times, where can I best get over the border, take this patch of land from NATO, etc. Now, it's possible, and I'm sure that's in a playbook in the Kremlin for one day in the future, maybe. But neither of us really think that's happening now, do we?
No, I don't, and I think that's what I was getting at earlier on about trying to what he might learn from testing our defences. But I think first of all, he's got enough on his plate with Ukraine. I mean, he can't afford to start a shooting war with NATO, and if he was going to start a shooting war with NATO, this would be a strange way of going about it.
I mean, he'd lose the shooting war with NATO. That's the point, isn't it? We all talk about NATO not being prepared, but if it really came to it, we have more jets, we have more armour and tanks somewhere that could eventually get into the right place. There's no way he could win even a short war against NATO today.
Well, I mean, let's go back to one of the episodes that we did a few months ago, where he's not going to take on all of NATO. I mean, that would be bonkers. You're absolutely right. He would lose that. But what he could do is fight a war for limited objectives that he could be confident in securing, and then dare us to come back at him after he hides behind the nuclear umbrella. But I don't think that's what this is. I think your first instinct, which is this is about a political test of NATO, is right.
Political test with a bit of threat. And it goes back to Lenin's strategy, actually, that great Lenin quote. You probe with bayonets. If you find mush, you push. If you find steel, you withdraw.
Yeah.
Sounds like the sort of pep talk you give at Sandhurst, Patrick.
I don't know how to respond to that, Tom.
Apart from denial, I'd hope.
Yes, yeah.
But the point being, this is what Russia has done for, a century now.
Yeah.
It does make us wonder, doesn't it? What would the UK's response be if Russian drones buzzed over Heathrow today, for example? I mean, we had a similar incident here last November, unidentified drones flying over the US airbase in Lakenheath up in Suffolk. That was all rather mysterious. And you personally have had some experience of other incidents when you're in the job.
Well, I've got two, actually. I was just thinking about it before we came on. So I saw a drone at Heathrow. So I was sitting in the lounge at Heathrow, flying off somewhere. I was still serving, still CGS at the time. And just hovering about 200 meters away, I saw a drone, hobby drone, just over one of the taxiways. So I went to the reception and said, I've just seen a drone. And they sort of said, where? And of course, the drone had gone. So they looked at me as if I was a bonkers.
Have another whiskey, General.
Yeah, exactly. That was it. And I had to explain who I was and the fact that I wasn't coming from a position of complete ignorance. So they closed the runway and then patrolled for about half an hour. But it was unquestionably a drone. Who knows where it came from? But the one you're referring to is, of course, what happened in Gatwick in 2018. Where drones, I think 2 drones were seen, and for about 30 minutes or so, there were lots of sightings. And so Gatwick was closed. And we had no particularly effective response for how to deal with it. And in the end, we ended up deploying, I think it was RAF regiment, because that's the function that the RAF regiment perform is to...
The RAF soldiers who
this
protect
this is the sort of private army that the RAF have, but their role is, their expertise is in air defence and defence of airfields, particularly overseas, and they're very, very good at it. And they brought the sort of capabilities that we have, I mean, not as advanced now as what you're seeing in Ukraine, and I think it closed Gatwick for 2 days, and the drones weren't seen again, so we don't know how effective our defences would have been. But it's hard. I mean, as the Danes are finding, this is really hard to respond to, because even if you see the drone, if you can't be confident of bringing it down in an area that is safe or in a controlled way, you risk collateral damage on civilian houses and the streets around airports.
So look, that's where we think Putin is. That's why we think Putin is doing all this. Next obvious question then, what should NATO do about it? So NATO has responded to this so far. I think, we can talk about this, but I think it's probably 6 out of 10 really in how they've responded. Militarily, okay. So the jets launched, the quick reaction alerts launched, and there's a good air defense system of pilots and jets ready to scramble all across the eastern border, and we play a part in that. So they launched, they've shot down a load of those Russian drones that went into Poland. Some Italian jets chased those MiG-31s out of Estonian airspace. And then Operation Eastern Sentry was launched to increase NATO's capacity to counter Russian threats, and they're sending more jets over there. I think we're flying some Typhoons. There are Article 4 consultations as well, and that is one down from Article 5, which is basically any alliance member saying, I want all of us to now sit down around a table and talk about it.
And it's only been triggered 9 times.
In NATO's entire history.
Yeah, so it's quite unusual.
So that all happened. The political response, though, in terms of what all different politicians said, well, I think it was a bit mediocre, to be brutally honest. So there was a almost immediate difference between the hawks and the doves. Donald Tusk, the Prime Minister of Poland, naturally saying, we take this incredibly seriously and we're going to shoot some stuff down if this happens again. Donald Trump tweeting, or truth socialing, I should say these days, a question. What is Putin up to? Not even condemning it, which is pretty awful and quite depressing. He got stronger since, but it wasn't the best. Would you
that
agree?
Business of leaving the door open. And, the reality is that, when you have 32 nations in alliance, the best thing about that alliance is you've got 32 nations, 32 democracies. But it's hard to align all of those nations together, particularly, as you say, when some of them are more dovish than some of the hawks are. And decision making and responses are slow and they're deliberate. But ultimately, they're also more effective because there are 32 nations. And, go back to what I was talking about George Kennan earlier on. His point was you've got to recognize this form of political warfare, your term hybrid warfare, for what it is. And as long as you respond consistently with resilience, with firmness, and with unity, then over time these tactics lose much of their force. So, should we talk about what NATO should now do to stop these Russian incursions and what it can do?
Yeah, I was really struck by a point that Ben Wallace, the former British Defence Secretary, made on all this. In other words, if you do something, there will be consequences, and you need to think very hard about that before you decide to do that something. So, a huge array of options, from the most dovish to the most hawkish. But presumably, Patrick, there's already a standing NATO doctrine for situations like this, as a formula, which you then dust down the manual and open, turn to page 27, and there it is.
Well, let's talk about this in terms of how you think about this strategically. So, what's happened here is a failure of deterrence. I mean, as you say, Putin doesn't think that there's going to be a cost for what he's doing, so he's probing. So you've got to restore deterrence. And deterrence, when we think about deterrence, we think about there being three components to it. So one is the capability. Do you have the capability to inflict harm or to resist your enemy? Are you credible? Is that capability credible? But are you politically credible? Are you going to demonstrate the will? They have to believe that you're going to use force against them. And then you've got to communicate it. So the two things you've got to do are, first of all, achieve deterrence by denial. That means defending NATO territory so that you're essentially making further attacks and incursions futile. There's no point in doing it anymore. And then the second thing you ought to do is to try and achieve deterrence by punishment. So this is what Ben was getting at. This is about imposing costs. Make the costs of Russian aggression too high to Putin when he thinks about the cost-benefit analysis. And if you're smart, you'll do both things in parallel, not one or the other sequentially, so that you're denying Putin this notion of escalation dominance, making sure that he's not the one controlling when you go up to the next ladder in the ladder of escalation. So you want to communicate this really clearly, but you also want to leave some ambiguity, because if you draw the line too starkly, it doesn't give the political leadership, the North Atlantic Council, the wherewithal to be flexible, but also you've got to sow doubt in Putin's mind.
Okay, let's dig into the detail of those then, right? So there's effectively defensive, offensive, or defensive and punitive, as you might prefer to call it. So defensive measures first, and some might say those are dovish, although you need to do them at the same time as everything else, to your point. So the most obvious ones, we need to keep shooting down UAVs that come into NATO airspace, and ideally find a slightly cheaper way of doing it.
Yeah,
because putting up £100 million aircraft, which is what a Typhoon costs, against a £100 coffee table drone, that's bad value for money by anyone's books, isn't it?
Yeah, and that may be the only reason not to, because there shouldn't be a cost to shooting down unmanned systems. You're not killing any Russian pilots, so the only thing you want to worry about is there going to be collateral damage where it comes down. And then, to your point, it's bonkers to use £1 million missiles against 10,000 pound drones.
So that needs to continue. The state of NATO's current air defences in general, though, they need to be maintained and considerably improved. And this is a point that NATO Secretary Mark Rutte has been making repeatedly. I remember listening to him at his Chatham House speech when he was over here in June. And his point was we need 5 times as many air defence systems across the entire alliance that we have today, 5 times that where we currently are. So what could that possibly like? Well, a drone wall is one of the suggestions that's doing the rounds at the moment. What does that mean? Well, effectively, layers of radar, other detection systems, acoustic sensors, etc., linked with air defense systems, from machine guns to Gatling guns to right up there to high energy lasers, which the Israelis now have. I don't know if you've seen the amazing video that's doing the rounds online. the Israelis actually firing their lasers at drones. Have you seen those?
I haven't. I mean, I've seen the system that we're fielding, that we're developing, called Dragonfire,
Which is amazing.
which is amazing. And what's fascinating about this is it turns out that the two hardest things, or my basic understanding of it, the two hardest things to achieve are to ensure that you're bringing enough energy onto the target, because of course the power of the laser dissipates over time. And then secondly, it's got to be able to track moving objects and hold on to it so that it's burning the same spot on whatever target you're. And that's really, really hard to do. And that's what DSDL have cracked with Dragonfire.
Yeah, it's fascinating. The Israelis actually have a laser battery in operation, which is a defensive one, obviously, in Israel, it's fascinating. We will have to come back and do an entire podcast on lasers. I feel that coming.
We might learn a little bit more than we currently know.
Do you think we've expended our entire knowledge on lasers in a minute? I know I have.
I'm pretty close to it, Tom.
Now, Latvia's President Egers Rinkovic. So he has another suggestion. He wants the alliance to upgrade its air policing mission across the Baltic states, which Britain plays a part in, to what he calls a full-scale air defence mission. Now, in brief, that means more jets and, interestingly, Patrick, far more aggressive rules of engagement. And that takes us on to another option, doesn't it?
It does. I'm just still giggling over your pronunciation, Tom.
Well, you enjoy my French. I haven't given you Russian yet, but I'm sure that's coming.
Yeah. So changing the rules of engagement is important. It's an enabler, but it's also, think about what I talked about in terms of communication. It's also a way of sending a clear message to Russia that we are prepared to escalate, and it would send a warning.
And a very interesting question from Leon, a listener who's emailed us to say, what is NATO's precise doctrine for responding to such provocations? And he also asks, when would NATO resort to an escalating military response, such as shooting down an aircraft? Patrick?
This is all about rules of engagement. And rules of engagement essentially center on two things. First of all, is the target, is your opposition, is whatever it is that you're up against, demonstrating hostile intent? So that's the threat of imminent use of force against NATO forces, personnel, property, or other designated persons or objects, as the doctrine goes.
What planes might be on with? They've got bombs on them. They've just got defense missiles, air-to-air missiles, that kind of stuff.
Exactly, and that's what happened in Estonia. They were not air-to-air missiles. And a hostile act, which is much clearer, is an attack or use of force against NATO. So an attack, hostile act is the actual use of force. It's happening already. Hostile intent is the imminent use of force. And we don't know what those exactly say at the moment, because the point is that rules of engagement are classified because you need to have some degree of ambiguity and doubt in the mind of your opponent.
Look, I get that, and I completely accept that. But it also strikes me that's a weakness, because if Putin, and we're not telling Putin overtly and publicly, there's a lot of back channels going on and people going to Moscow to whisper things in his ear, don't do this again, etc. But if it's not overt, then he can exploit that.
No, so I'm answering the question that the listener asked. What's the precise doctrine? And we don't know what the precise current doctrine is because it's classified. So if you change the rules of engagement and you communicate a change to a more permissive, a more aggressive set of rules of engagement, without describing precisely what they are, then you're achieving a deterrent effect because you're communicating credibility and capability. The other way that you might think about this is, at the moment, we have an air policing mission. Now, I don't have the air power doctrine handbook sitting in front of me, but there is a difference between air policing and air defense. And of course, the Baltic states don't have their own air forces and aren't in a position to defend themselves.
I was amazed to discover that with the MiG-31s overflying Estonia, that the Estonians don't have their own jets, which is presumably one of the reasons why Putin chose Estonia to do that overflight. Because another interesting characterization here is NATO has one set of rules of engagement, which are probably a bit more complicated and need a little bit more of a political sign-off. Individual nation states can do what they want. So they set their own rules of engagement. So, for example, Donald Tusk, the Prime Minister's opponent, could have shot down anything he wanted. The Estonians could have blown the MiGs clean out of the sky if they wanted to as well.
Yeah. And of course, that's happened before. So that's precisely what happened in Turkey in 2015 over Syria. And Russian aircraft, Russian fighter jets were repeatedly drifting into, going into Turkish airspace. And so the Turks shot one down. There was a 17-second airspace violation. But the point is that there was a repeated pattern from the Russians, and the Turks warned the Russians and warned that individual aircraft that if they didn't stop, they would act, and they did.
And guess what? No more Russian Sukhois flying into Turkish airspace.
Yeah.
Well, where is Donald Trump on all this? Because that is the big question really in play. And as we said, he was a bit lukewarm to begin with. He then toughened up quite considerably. And listen to what he said, because last week he was asked whether first NATO should hit back at Russia's provocations, shoot down a Russian jet.
Mr. President, do you think that NATO countries should shoot down Russian aircraft if they enter their airspace?
Yes, I do.
And B, whether the US would actually join in.
Would you back up NATO allies? You said that you thought that they should shoot down the Russian aircraft. Would you back them up? Would the United States help them out in some way?
Depends on the circumstance, but we're very strong toward NATO.
So that's the dilemma there, isn't it, Patrick? Trump talks a big game, but what would actually happen? Would he really pull the trigger? Would he authorize US jets to retaliate, to shoot down a Russian jet? So far, he's completely untested on that front, certainly in terms of confrontation with Russia, maybe against Iran, but not with Russia. And he spent a long time trying to be friends with Putin. And crucially, he got elected, and I covered the US election campaign for 6 months last year, to end the wars.
I think you're right. He was elected to end wars. He was certainly elected to prevent wars. And so he has shown a track record of using military force to prevent escalation. So he used lethal force against Qasem Soleimani. He took him out because of the mayhem he was causing in the region. He struck the Houthis, he struck in Syria, and most recently, of course, he struck Iran. So there are, the use of decisive force clearly signaled at the right time is part of Trump's playbook.
Well, those are the defensive measures, although some of them feel quite offensive. Deterrence by denial, as you might put it in slightly more intelligent terms. What about the other stuff, the offensive stuff or the punitive stuff, as you put it, imposing costs on Russia, deterrence by punishment?
So what you're trying to do here, Tom, as you say, is to impose cost. And that's escalatory. Mm. Now, when we think about escalation, we think in terms of vertical escalation. So that's increasing the intensity of violence, but probably in the same geographical theatre. So an example of vertical escalation, at the lower end might simply be to respond symmetrically and proportionately. So the Russians are doing incursions into NATO airspace. You could do a NATO incursion into Russian airspace in an area that really worries them. And that would be somewhere like the Kola Peninsula, where much of their nuclear assets and their northern fleet is gathered.
Remind the listeners and me where the Kola Peninsula is.
The Kola Peninsula is that bit of Russia just north of Norway. And that's what gives Russia its access into the Atlantic with its submarines and its northern fleet.
The other symmetrical response could be, which I suspect some people might wonder why we're not doing already, is why aren't we sticking a load of little cheap drones over Moscow airport or St. Petersburg airport just to piss them off like they're pissing us off?
Honestly, I don't think we've got enough drones.
Well, you can buy them down Argos. These little tiny things that will close an entire airport.
Yeah.
Argos, central Moscow.
So I think this would be seen as you could do it covertly, rather like the Ukrainians did with Operation Spider's Web. You remember the episode that we did on that. But we are a defensive alliance, and at the moment, I think one of the lines that we're not going to cross is deploying NATO weapons or assets onto Russian soil or Russian airspace operated by NATO nations. Or you've got horizontal escalation, which might be taking it to a different theatre or to a different domain. So you're attacking in the maritime domain rather than on land. Or it might be doing something completely different in, for example, a diplomatic or an economic way. So you're probably the best person to tell us. How do you think what do you think imposing costs in diplomatic terms would be?
Well, that's the lowest level, isn't it? That's the most hawkish punitive measure, which is not necessarily hawkish itself, but that's like the lowest rung of how do we hit back, if you like. Diplomatic expulsions is the obvious thing to do, and we've seen that quite a few times over the last at least decade or so with Russia. Most famously during or just after the Salisbury poisonings, when Sergei Skripal and his daughter were almost killed by Russian GUR agents. And Europe threw out a whole load of Russian diplomats who are actually spies, GUR agents, and so did the United States.
But it really had an effect. I mean, the Russians were absolutely gobsmacked at the scale of the response. So, we dismiss this as lower end in terms of imposing cost, but it does absolutely impose a cost. I mean, they were cut off from sources of intelligence. It was humiliating for Russia. They saw how the West came together in response to that in a way they weren't expecting. Because, of course, previously we'd had Litvinenko and we'd done nothing.
What about some other more punchy measures that are open to us?
So what is it that Putin is most frightened of? I mean, a color revolution. So a strategy of political subversion. It's not going to be quick. It may not have any success, but a long-term approach to undermining Putin's regime, to weakening him, to sowing discord and division at home.
You call that a color revolution?
So think of the Orange Revolution in Ukraine.
Got it.
And the Russians characterize this as part of Western warfare. They think that we are trying to overthrow regimes through the use of what they call color revolutions. I mean, that really does unnerve and unsettle the Russians. And then you can switch into a different domain. So, for example, the cyber domain. And whether you do it deniably or whether you fess up to it, there are a sliding scale of things that European forces, that European nations, that NATO nations could do. We've got very advanced capabilities. The US have got very advanced capabilities. But you can step this all the way out from the sort of things that the Russians are doing to us, right down to critical attacks on national infrastructure, election interference, and so on.
Another dangerous game, because you don't really want to trigger a response and have our power stations closed down or our internet cut off if the Russians can do that.
Yeah, and that's the game.
Okay, well, let's move on to the toughest response of all, the most horizontal, if you like. Proper military response incurring into Russian territory. So, for example, blockade or an invasion of some shape or form. And this is a suggestion from an analyst, Guy, and he emailed us this. He says, I have since 2014 wondered why NATO has not retaliated more symmetrically to Russia's aggression by cutting off and then possibly annexing the Kaliningrad Oblast. It is surrounded by NATO countries and would be relatively easy to cut off from supply chains and then defend before holding a democratic election process. Russian aggression shows no sign of abating and a harder punch is needed, says Guy. Now, Kaliningrad is obviously a Russian enclave that was part of the Soviet Union from 1945 onwards, right up there on the Baltic, nestled at the very top of Germany and the Baltic states. It's been Russian for a long time and remains Russian. And does he have a point, Patrick? It's pretty punchy, but you could surround and blockade Kaliningrad, and actually, you could probably even take it if you wanted to.
Yeah, it's a really smart question, and it turns the traditional thinking about Kaliningrad on its head, because when we think about Kaliningrad, we think of this as a Russian outpost able to protect what we call anti-access area denial capabilities and deny large swathes of the Baltic to us.
In other words, tactically hugely useful to Russia.
To Russia, yes. So it's a different way of thinking about it. I mean, I think the answer, honestly, to Guy is NATO is a defensive alliance. We don't invade other countries. We defend ourselves against other countries invading us. Now, that's not to say that you couldn't play a scenario rather like China is contemplating over Taiwan, where you would quarantine Kaliningrad. You would make it much more difficult for Russia to sustain it. You impose economic costs, political costs. You begin to revisit some of the agreements that the Baltic states have about access through their states into Kaliningrad. But I think at this stage, it's probably an overreaction to what Russia are doing.
Well, let's get off the fence now, Patrick, because we've been around the houses really interestingly. And to guide us, it's a very interesting question, the one you just posed, really, because we really need to work out whether we're at war with Russia or not. Lady Eliza Manningham-Buller, former head of MI5, said precisely that this week. She thinks we are actually at war with Russia. What do you think?
I don't think we are at war with Russia, but I think Russia thinks of itself as being at war with the rest. It thinks of itself as being engaged in the way that Putin characterizes it as an existential struggle between the West and the traditional values that he espouses for Russia. And Russians think about war and warfare differently to us. So we think of this in quite binary terms, whereas for the Russians, they just have a series of different instruments that they will use to constantly weaken and keep their opponents off balance. And that's what we're seeing at the moment. So where Russia is waging warfare against the West, attacking undersea cables through a program of disinformation, of subversion, of assassinations, of sabotage. Those are all acts of warfare that they're waging, political warfare. But no, we're not at war yet. And if we play things right and we can restore deterrence, we won't be at war with Russia. So from all of those options that we've been kicking around, as you put in your language, from dovish to hawkish, in my language, up and down the ladder of escalation, what do you think NATO should do?
Okay, so here's how I see it. I think, first of all, NATO urgently needs a unified position. It's really interesting talking this through. They are divided on so many different areas, and that is what Putin wants. So come together and form a joint view and stick to it. But secondly, I think it's time to call Putin's bluff. And what do I mean by that? Well, it means shooting down an aircraft and telling him we're going to do so beforehand. It means tackling force with force, strength with strength. Because here's the thing. Putin is panicking. He probably wants a confrontation. It would work for him, but he doesn't actually want to go all the way. He doesn't want the war, as we discussed, because he'd lose it. So let's call his bluff first. Let's get on the front foot, call his bluff, and watch him retreat.
I think I agree with most of that. I mean, I'm going to fall back on Kennan. I mean, in fact, two US strategists of the Cold War, Kennan and Nietzsche, and they said different things. So Kennan was all about building resilience against subversion, these sort of political acts of political warfare that we've seen, not dancing to Putin's tune. But what Nietzsche was all about was maintaining credible deterrence and military strength to contain direct aggression. So I think it is a blend of those two things. It's a blend of patience and resilience and making sure that these sort of tactics in the end lose their force. But I think as well as restoring, we've got to restore deterrence by drawing a line. And that means doing something like the Turks did, where you make it really clear, you communicate that we are going to act. That has to be taken seriously. It's got to be done with credibility, and you pick your moment.
Okay, there we have it. That's it for today. As always, do send your questions and thoughts to generalandjournalist@thetimes.co.uk. That's generalandjournalist@thetimes.co.uk. We read them all, and they are really, really helpful to us. So until next week, bye, Patrick.
Bye, Tom.